All right, looks like we're live with the newest episode of We the Individuals, where we believe in the novel proposal that we each choose our own manner of being governed. I am Chris Calton, Anna Chris, as you can see my nickname there. With me, as usual, I have Jeff Peterson II, the founder and co-owner of We the Individuals. He corrected me. I've been introducing him wrong for months now, and he finally actually corrected me on his founder and co-ownership status. And with us again is Blaine Kelly in the shadows over there. And we have the pleasure of interviewing today Dr. Lawrence Reed, who is the director of FEE, the Foundation for Economics Education. I'm sure a lot of libertarians, anybody watching this, is probably at least somewhat familiar with FEE. They are an educational group that reaches out to students. Dr. Reed, I actually went to one of your organization's seminars last summer. One of my history professors, fortunate enough, my thesis advisor is actually a libertarian, and he referred me to it, and I got a lot of his. I got more out of it than I expected to. Let's put it that way. There were some lectures here that really planted some nice ideas in my head that I've been mulling over ever since. FEE, on top of these seminars that we go to, they publish the Freeman magazine, and then of course you also speak at other Austrian-related events. I saw you speak myself at one of Bob Murphy's events with Ron Paul and Tom Woods 2 or 3 years back. I never got a chance to talk to you, so it's a pleasure to talk to you now. And what we're going to do, because we've had quite a few Austrian economists on recently, Bob Murphy and Walter Block, but to make this where we're not rehashing a lot of the same conversations, you edited a book about the myths of progressivism, which is what Jeff Peterson is holding up right now. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but all these articles are accessible on FEE's website, correct?
That's correct, yes.
And you wrote some. I think your dad wrote some.
No, by my dad, you might be thinking of Leonard Reed, but he was not my father.
I did not
A lot
know
of people
that.
make that. That's all right. He was our founder, but he spelled his name R-E-A-D. My name is spelled 2 E's. I knew him, but we were not related.
Well, I'm glad I'm not the only person that makes that mistake. I guess it's an easy one to get since you you inherited his chairmanship of FEE. So intellectual father of a sort, right? Can we go? I'm just trying to say.
Oh, absolutely. He was. Yeah, not just for me, but for a lot of people.
Leonard Reed, for those who don't know, he wrote I Pencil, which is often credited to Milton Friedman, because Milton Friedman used that explanation in one of his Free to Choose videos, so a lot of people think that that's a Milton Friedman piece of brilliance, but that is actually Leonard Reed, and one of the most brilliant, pithy explanations. Leonard Reed also, he brought the law, and it just did a lot of good things, brought Friedrich Bastiat's The Law into English. I wish he was still around where we could interview him as well. That would just be wonderful. But in the meantime, back to the myths of progressivism. So what I'm going to try to do, and what Jeff and Blaine are going to try to do, is we're going to throw you some challenges, some progressive myths. We're going to do our best to play devil's advocate, some of the ones that we get thrown at us the most often, and we're going to see what answer you give, because I'm sure your answers are better than any of ours will. I think Blaine, I'm going to let Blaine open up with this because he wants to talk about just kind of the origins of the book real quick. Blaine, go ahead with your questions.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering, what was the driving motivation behind writing this book?
It's been apparent for a long time that academia is dominated by those of a progressive perspective, and that free market ideas are not only, in a lot of places, they're not presented at all. So we felt very strongly at FEE, and also at Young Americans for Freedom, which collaborated with us and made this book a joint project. We felt very strongly that we needed to provide a volume that would give students primarily the arguments they needed to rebut a lot of the progressive nonsense that they're getting in their college classrooms. So that was the origin of it, and we ended up putting together 52 chapters. They don't by any means comprise rebuttals to all of the progressive misconceptions and half-truths and falsehoods, but they certainly, I think, deal with most of the very major ones, if not all of the major ones.
So you kind of go about it on an individual case-by-case basis?
Yeah, each of the 52 chapters myth that progressives are fond of presenting as fact. Everything from, capitalism caused the Great Depression to child labor is an evil capitalist thing and must be abolished, just on down the list, 52 in total.
Well, before I get into some of the ones that I think we hear the most, what's the one that you hear the most, since you've been having this argument since probably much longer than any of us?
Well, that varies from time to time and what's been hot in the news at the moment. But I know a few years ago, not long after the 2008 crash, and of course well before our book came out, the thing I heard the most was, depressions and recessions are caused by capitalism. And so, we did put in the book a chapter that I wrote about the Great Depression. These days, probably what I hear most often is something having to do with economic inequality. It varies that nobody should own as much as the 1% do, to the 1% or wealthy people in general can only get that way if they rip other people off. Various ways of demonizing, in many cases, successful people without differentiating between those who are successful by serving the consumer and those who are successful, at least in part, by using their political connections. I certainly make that distinction, and I don't like those in the latter category who use their political connections for personal gain. But that's not capitalism. Anyway, economic inequality and myths related to it, I probably hear more about today than anything else, maybe reflecting the discussion going on in the presidential campaign.
Absolutely. I think ever since Occupy Wall Street, at least, that's been
Yeah.
that's been one I hear over and over again. Even among libertarians, a lot of them, you're making the case for capitalism as a cure for inequality. Do you agree with that, or do you make a different argument?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I wouldn't say if to describe capitalism as a cure for inequality does contain a couple misconception implication anyway that I think is wrong, is that inequality by itself is an ailment or an illness that needs cured. The first thing I would point out is that people are not equal from one to another. We're all different. We have different talents. We have different savings rates. We work at different paces, and some people work smarter and longer than other people do. There are a lot of reasons why in a free society where people are allowed to be themselves, they will not generate equal incomes. We're just different. One place in the world where you would expect economic investing the same, earning the same, regardless of their contribution in the marketplace, would be a completely way you could achieve it is to put a gun at everybody's head and tell them you can't produce more than the next guy, you can't be more creative than the next guy, you can't be there first, don't invent anything that somebody else doesn't invent at the same time. You'd have to tell people to not be human, not be themselves. So I don't think inequality is an ailment. However, I think it's important to point out that not all inequality is due to natural or justifiable factors. Some inequality, the kind that I don't like and any libertarian should not like, derives from some people using their political connections or special favors that government may give them to disadvantage their competitors or to get a subsidy at other people's expense. I don't like that. But do away with that so you have genuine capitalism, and yeah, you'll still have inequality, but it will more accurately reflect the contributions that each of us makes in the marketplace as valued by our customers.
Absolutely. Okay, and I guess the follow-up to that's the most common challenge that we're getting today, and I would agree with you, that's probably the one I hear the most. What's the one that, if you have one in mind that's not in the book, that you do hear from time to time? Is there anything?
That's not in the book. That's a good question. I've been focusing so much in all my speaking about what's in it, I haven't thought much about what isn't. But there certainly are many.
I'm asking that because I just went through all 52 questions, I think, before the show to review, and
Yeah.
I couldn't think of one. So you may not have one.
Well, one topic that I think we were pretty light on, I think I put one essay in there to explain some fundamentals, but certainly is a much bigger issue society-wide, concerns the issue of pollution and environmental conservation. So, yeah, if I had to do the book over again, or if I could add additional chapters, I might do more in that area, because there are a lot of people who seem to think that capitalism, by its very nature, is a polluter. They don't realize that the biggest single polluter in the United States today are municipalities, governments. And none of us who are libertarian would ever argue that it's the right of any firm or any person to pollute another person's environment against his will. So even we would argue that if there's a role for government, it surely is to protect private property rights in the air around you or the water you drink. But the answer to most pollution problems, believe it or not, is in the direction of private property. If you look around the world, what tends to get polluted? It tends to be property that nobody owns, or in some socialist societies, everybody owns, which really has no meaning at all. Nobody has an incentive to husband it, take care of it, improve it, prosecute or go after people who ravage it in any way. Only in a private property regime do you have direct incentives to take care of resources and the opportunity for people to take you to court and prove you've transgressed their property rights if you are a polluter. So far better than top-down bureaucratic mandates, I think a more strict, careful application of property rights is probably going to be more helpful in reducing pollution in the long run than what we've been doing through bureaucratic agencies like the EPA.
Yeah. Well, if you ever, I guess, publish another edition, I think the best, when I finally got how I felt comfortable arguing that was actually in the fee seminar I mentioned. I think it was one of your lecturers, John Hasness, gave a lecture on how lawsuits would handle environment. It's the first time that clicked. I was like, oh, that's such a good answer for this. So you definitely have the fellows at fee to do that topic some justice.
I think you're right. Oh, by the way, if I could add, I think another topic concerns money. I mean, in the real world, right at the moment, I really think this is a far more important issue for the long term than most people think it is. Most people just accept that we should have a Federal Reserve, that it's doing a decent job, that it's going to manage the money supply for us and do it well. But I'm one of those economists who are very concerned about the long-run effects of central banking and the Federal Reserve action. So I would like to have put more in the book about market alternatives to government money, and to directly address the myth that money is an invention of the government or must be monopolized by the government, because I don't believe that at all.
Well, that, and I think Paul Krugman made an article showing how this is a progressive myth right there. The Federal Reserve stabilized the economy, and he says that if you don't count the Great Depression and the Great Recession, the economy was much more volatile before the Federal Reserve, and then even then, those recessions are connected to the greenbacks and the other two central banks.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I don't get my economics from Paul Krugman any more than I get my nuclear technology from him.
If you did, we probably wouldn't be speaking so highly of fee, I'm sure.
One of my biggest grievances is whenever when there's typically newbies to economics or socialists, they'll say how bad money is and how bad the money system is, and I agree, but sometimes they set up this false dichotomy that's either the system we have now, a Federal Reserve, or no money at all. And they don't think of it in between actually a market, free market and money. So they start and fall back to more primitive things like barter and like gifts economies or something, as opposed to a free market and banking. I get that a lot and I can't stand it.
Yeah, you see that not only in money but almost every other issue. Progressives and socialists have a way of taking what they perceive to be a problem, and usually it is, and assuming that it had no history, and that the answer is always more government. It's as if, we had a financial crisis in 2008. Government must have been an innocent bystander. Free markets must have caused it, and therefore more government is the answer. They never turn the clock back and ask themselves, might government have been a part of, if not the problem in the first place? And of course, in bringing about the 2008 crisis, it couldn't have happened had it not been for government. With dirt cheap interest rates by the Federal Reserve, flooding the system with easy money for years, and then the acts of Congress and the bureaucracy and jawboning banks to make loans to people who couldn't pay them back. I mean, that's all government centered, not something that happens in laissez-faire or free markets.
Absolutely. Jeff, let's stick with you. Jeff brought up, he was most curious about some of my favorite topics, because I'm a history guy, but I'll let Jeff pick your brain on those questions.
One question I had was, we met in Salt Lake City when you were here a couple of weeks ago. You spoke about Hoover and FDR. Now, I always know the myth. Robert Murphy covered this in his Myths of the Great Depression, and he said that Hoover was actually known to be by a free market president. But what I didn't know is what you brought up, and I hope you can expound on that, is that FDR actually ran on a campaign platform of less spending, less government, as opposed to what he turned into.
That's absolutely right, and I do have a chapter devoted in the book, and also a separate chapter more broadly on the Great Depression, in which I mention this. You're right, Jeff, and this is so easy for people to find. They don't have to take their professor's word for it, or for the opposite, as most people get. In 1932, the Democratic Party platform, which Franklin Roosevelt ran for president, called for a 25% reduction in federal spending. It was the largest proposed reduction in federal spending of any major party in American history. Roosevelt attacked Hoover, rightly, for raising taxes, raising spending, raising tariffs, and he promised to cut those things if elected. He accused, excuse me, at one point, pardon me, he accused Hoover of presiding over, and these are FDR's words, the greatest taxing and spending administration in American history. Roosevelt's running mate, John Nance Garner from Texas, actually accused Hoover of, quote, leading the country down the path to socialism. And they were right, because Hoover was a massively interventionist president. He doubled the income tax. He raised tariffs and virtually closed our borders to international trade, igniting a trade war. Lots of stuff. He had his bailout schemes, Reconstruction Finance Corporation. He dramatically increased federal spending, raised the deficit. So Roosevelt promised to deal with all those things, and if you believed in 1932 that big government was the problem, you would have voted for Franklin Roosevelt. I mean, you had a socialist alternative. You had Norman Thomas running as a socialist. He got less than 2% of the vote. Or you could have voted for more intervention through Hoover. But if you believed in free markets, you would have voted for Franklin Roosevelt. But upon election, and for the entire time he was in office, of course, he moved in precisely the opposite direction on almost every front.
Do you have a book? Do you have a book that's your favorite analysis of the Great Depression?
Oh, there are several really good ones. Burton Folsom's New Deal or Raw Deal is fantastic. That's probably my favorite.
It's one of my favorites.
Yeah, anything Burt writes is terrific. That's called.
He's a brilliant historian.
Yeah,
my favorite's probably going to be. I haven't read actually Raw Deal, New Deal, but my favorite is, and probably Blaine would agree with me, is probably going to be America's Great Depression by Murray Rothbard is going to be my favorite one.
Yeah, that's a very good one. The only shortcoming is that it takes you up to about 1932, and it does a great job in explaining how the Depression began. But you have to go to other works to get the story on why it was so long, what happened later in the 30s. But it is a very good book, as is Jim Powell's FDR's Folly. That's a terrific book on the Great Depression, too.
I would also mention Robert Higgs's Depression, War, and Cold War.
Oh, yeah. Anything Bob Higgs does, especially on the size and growth of government, is always terrific.
And of course, Bob Murphy's politically incorrect Guide to the Great Depression. But I
Oh
think
yeah,
he even says in it, he's like, "I want to thank Burton Folsom Jr. for doing all the heavy
Yeah.
lifting on this one."
yeah.
So I've got a second your recommendation. I'm a huge fan of. Again, I'm a history guy. I'm biased, but Burton Folsom Jr. is just one of my favorite
Yeah. And
historians
Bob
out there.
Murphy's book that you cited, I second that. It's very good too.
Absolutely. Both easy reads, good explanations. Okay, I've got some of my own questions. So, I am a Christian, and some of my friends are Christian. Obviously, a lot of people in libertarianism are very atheist, very agnostic. That's popular pairings of ideas. But there's also a large faction of Christian anarchists and Christian libertarians out there. And I know that you've talked a lot about Jesus and socialism, capitalism in the Bible, and then of course you got the render unto Caesar, Romans 13. I've had these thrown at me a
Yeah.
lot lately with this taxation is theft theory. So can I hear you talk about that a little bit? Why
Oh,
Jesus
sure.
was not a socialist?
Yeah. In fact, one of the chapters in Excuse Me, Professor is about Jesus and whether or not he was a socialist. I later expanded that, about doubled it in size, and we published it at Fee as a separate monograph. So,
Hmm.
and it's in that form, which any of your listeners could um, purchase for next to nothing, or read it free on our website. In that version, it's entitled "Rendering Unto Caesar: Was Jesus a Socialist?" Well, I firmly believe, as an economist and as a Christian, that Jesus was not a socialist. There is not a single reference anywhere in the New Testament that suggests even remotely that Jesus supported or endorsed political redistribution of wealth. Quite the opposite. Time and again, he says things that strongly support the notion of private property, rule of law, and individual rights. My favorite passage in this regard is from the book of Luke, Luke 12:13 through 15. A man comes up to Christ and says to him, Master, speak to my brother, that he divideth the inheritance with me. In other words, hey, I don't think I got my fair share. You've got some influence and some power. Why don't you divvy things up a little better so I can get more? Well, Jesus did not respond by saying anything like, oh, I'll look into it. Maybe you didn't get a fair shake, or yeah, I could probably take some from that guy if he got more and give it to you. Nothing like that. Instead, what he did was, on the spot, without skipping a beat, he rebuked the man for his envy. He said in response to the man, Man, who made me a judge or divider over you? Take heed and beware of covetousness. Now, don't you wish for the day when our leaders in Congress, like Nancy Pelosi, would stand up and say, I used to believe in taking from some and giving to others, but I just realized who made me a judge or divider over you? Wouldn't that be a new and great day? And also, Jesus many times talked about how he was on earth to uphold the law. And the core of that, of course, was the Ten Commandments. And the Eighth and the Tenth Commandments are strongly pro-private property. The Eighth Commandment says, "Thou shalt not steal," and the Tenth says, "Thou shalt not covet." So, in other words, if it's not yours, keep your cotton picking fingers off of it, and don't even think of taking it. Don't even think of envying it or coveting it if it's not yours. Um, and then we have the story of the Good Samaritan, in which a man who has been beaten to within an inch of his life and robbed is lying along the road, and a man comes by, and the man does not say to the unfortunate one, "Oh, you need to see your social worker or contact the emperor," or "I'm sorry, it's not my responsibility." Instead, he pitches in immediately, and with his own resources, he helps the man in need. And the lesson there is that's what good people do when they see others around them who are in need. And you hold them accountable for what you do for them as well, so that they ultimately really do deserve it. If that man had simply said to the one in the gutter, sorry, this is for a politician to tend to, then I think we'd know him today as the good-for-nothing Samaritan.
Yeah. Well, not only that, but in the story, I mean, it starts off with the religious people passing him by. So, I mean, I think that's part of it too.
Yeah.
It's saying that you should give to charity and it should be voluntary. And of course, they were the same people, the same group of people challenging Jesus later on the render unto Caesar. I actually, I'll tell you, I specifically wanted to bring this question up because I have a friend of mine who just started at our college, the Young Americans for Liberty chapter, and he just got brought into libertarian within the past few months, and he's getting real into it, real excited. He's a super religious guy, and I sent him the article that you mentioned, the separate publication online, to read. And so he was asking me about like Leo Tolstoy today because it's like I heard he was a Christian anarchist. I'm trying to look into this, so I'm specifically asking this question to send this to him later on. So
that's great.
I'm very grateful for the intelligent response there.
Oh, thank you. That little pamphlet and the essay, the shorter essay that is in the book, has really struck a chord. I mean, I can't tell you how many thousands. We're in the second printing already. Thousands and thousands of those things have been purchased or given away, and the views on the website, fee.org, where we have it, are just off the charts. So I think it struck a chord out there.
And I think it's important. There's, I think we've brought up in one of, I think our first show, thick libertarianism, and why we don't like it, because, a lot of my friends in the libertarian community are atheist and agnostic, and that's fine. That's absolutely their prerogative. But why do you not want to reach this wide group of religious people that this will strike a chord with? So I'm glad you're doing that.
We'll never win. We'll never win the future for liberty if we tell the world, you got to be an atheist, or you got to think like I do on religious matters before I can convince you of liberty. I mean, that's absurd. Why not point out to people that, in my belief anyway, there's nothing incompatible between Christianity, as I understand it, and libertarianism. Christ was a libertarian in a sense.
Yeah.
In a sense, he never called for government action to take from some and give to others.
I think you can, and we're going to go to Blaine. We'll move on to a different topic, but I think you can make the argument that it's incompatible with other ideologies, is what I would argue. But Blaine has a question for you as well.
Yeah, you were mentioning earlier about the ignorance of people about the potential for market money, and I was wondering if you saw any prospects for that coming about in the future with the possible dissolution of the European Union, Switzerland's referendums, things like that. More interest in market monies in general, or gold-based monies.
Yeah, well, if or when the EU falls apart, and that's probably a matter of time, my guess is that the initial response of the various governments will be to reinstitute their own national currencies. That's not, it doesn't go anywhere near where I would with money, because I'm with, say, Hayek, who believed in the denationalization of money. If there's a role for government, it might be simply to define it, or at least stand ready to allow for people who are being defrauded, to go to court to prove it. But otherwise, I think it should be like weights and measures. I think in our country, the government defines what a pound is. It's 16 ounces. It defines what a foot is. It's 12 inches. But it doesn't, from that point, go on to say, and only the government can produce rulers, yardsticks, or scales. Instead, it says, look, as long as you don't defraud anybody, as long as if you sell it as a yardstick, it better be 36 inches, not 35. Then you're perfectly fine to do with it what you want. I don't see any more need for government in money than simply that kind of definitional function. But even there, I have a few qualms that the market would sort that out. We don't have to worry about whether or not light bulbs we buy actually fit in the sockets we've got at home, because the market has effectively standardized that. I think the same thing would happen with money. I just don't trust politicians with money, and there's no reason to.
Yeah.
We had many instances of historical monies. The dollar itself was a measure of silver. It was a particular quantity of troy ounces of silver, and many of the other national currencies that were then adopted and co-opted by governments originated in the market.
That's right. The British pound was once a pound of silver.
Yeah.
And the names of the currencies related directly to a weight of precious metal. But as part of the process of government divorcing money from the real stuff over the years, those names don't mean effectively anything today.
Well, even with paper money, I think Hong Kong today still has privately issued paper money, and even in the United States, the free banking period, I think Murray Rothbard talks about the Suffolk Bank, which was basically a private central bank that actually did what the Federal Reserve was supposed to do.
Yeah.
Though the Federal Reserve failed miserably, this private entity with its paper money made sure that people weren't issuing in like destructive, like low reserves and things of that nature. So even when you do move to the paper notes, it's interesting to see what'll happen in the
Yeah.
free market.
And even on a gold standard,
Yeah.
that doesn't mean that the only thing that circulates is money or bits of gold. In fact, when people know that their paper is backed by it, that they can get the real thing upon demand, they'd prefer to use the paper. It's easier to carry. It's the connection that's important, not the actual form that money in your pocket may take. It's the connection to something that's sound, stable, reliable, and that you can count on. And in a free market, who's to say what might be money? My guess is you'd have a multiplicity of monies, and people could choose. Can you imagine when the first credit card came out, if government had said, oh my, here's a new form of payment, we better monopolize this. Everybody's going to have just one single government-issued credit card. Well, they didn't do that, and as a result today, there's competition in this form of payment that we call a credit card. You can get a Visa, MasterCard, Amex, you name it. We have competition. And there's nobody, to my knowledge, who would ever argue that we'd be better off if we had a single government monopoly issuer of credit cards.
Yeah.
And I have one follow-up question to that. You did mention that you suspected there would probably be competing currencies in a free market. Could you address the myth that it's a problem to have more than one competing currency? Say silver competing against gold. And you have the misrepresentation of Gresham's law that bad money drives out good money. Could you speak a little bit about that and bimetallism, perhaps?
Oh, yeah, that's a favorite topic of mine. I did my master's dissertation on the Panic of 1893 and the gold-silver issues that led up to it. I'm not an advocate of what Alexander Hamilton inaugurated as bimetallism, in which he said, look, we're going to have both gold and silver circulate as money. That part's fine with me. But then he made the mistake of fixing the price of one in terms of the other. And as a free market economist, I recognize that the moment you fix prices, the moment you declare that one substance is worth X amount of another, and you don't change it to reflect real conditions in the marketplace, you set yourself up for all kinds of problems. So at first, and for about 40 years, Hamilton fixed the ratio of gold to silver in a way that overvalued silver artificially. Silver wasn't worth as much as his ratio or his price control said that it was. So silver flowed into the mint, but elsewhere, into other uses or overseas. So until the 1830s, the primary money in America was silver, very little gold. And that was not because it was official policy. Official policy was just the opposite. They wanted both metals to circulate, but they fixed the price in terms of one over the other. So then Congress decided in 1834 to change that, but instead of just saying, look, we're going to honor each metal at the market price, instead they said, well, let's just change the fixed price. So they did, and this time they overvalued gold. And so then the opposite happened. Over a number of years, gold flowed into the Treasury. That's what was primarily minted, and silver went someplace else. So we flip-flopped, even though the official policy was bimetallism, we flip-flopped to a de facto gold standard until the Civil War, when both North and South departed from gold, issued lots of paper, and so forth. But bimetallism is unsustainable when you fix the price of one in terms of the other. And Blaine, you mentioned Gresham's law in particular. A lot of people know that as simply bad money drives out good money.
Right.
But it's important to recognize that there's more to it. Bad money drives out good money when government fixes the ratio. And that's what I just explained. In a free market where there is no price control and metals flow to in whatever direction they're most valued, The opposite is true. Good money tends to drive out the bad money. For the same reason, good products tend to drive out bad products in free markets where people are free to choose. So I have no doubt that in a free market, there wouldn't probably be a single money, but nor would there be so many that it would be confusing. The market would tend to sort that out, and you'd end up with the monies that people find most dependable, most reliable. Who knows what that might be? In the future, it could be gold, could be silver, could be Bitcoin, could be, any number of other things. But the point is, let competition make those decisions, not politicians.
Sure. Jeff, you have another question.
Yeah, it was actually a rather quick one. What you think of whenever people bring up, well, specifically with Bernie Sanders, they always mention how Scandinavia countries are examples of what we should look towards. So I was wanting to know what your take is on whenever. Well, first of all, one thing is that I tend to notice that the way that democratic socialism is defined tends to be different than what Scandinavia actually is. So I think they have their definitions mixed up.
Yeah.
And what your thoughts on them pointing towards Scandinavia as a shining beacon of an example that we should strive towards?
Okay, I'm convinced that Bernie Sanders doesn't have a clue what Scandinavia really looks like. I mean, he thinks of it, and this is about all he knows of it, that they have high income tax rates, and that's what he likes, especially high income tax rates on the successful. But what he doesn't talk about is that those countries don't have nationalized industries, which is a hallmark of full-blown socialism. They don't have restricted markets. They are fully globalized. They have there's lots of free trade between Scandinavian countries, relative free trade in the rest of the world. They have far more school choice. Sweden has universal school choice, lots of private options. Bernie Sanders isn't for any of that stuff. He's only for the high. He likes to punish wealthy people, so he likes that part. But he doesn't like the other that I mentioned so far. Nor does he like the fact that Scandinavian countries have even lower rates of taxation on business income than the United States does. We have higher corporate income tax rates than Scandinavia does. So
We have the highest in the
Bernie
world.
was saying, yeah, the highest in the industrialized world. So he's cherry picking what he likes, which is basically whatever punishes the successful, he's for, and whatever locks the poor and middle class into monopoly government services like lousy government schools, he has no problem with.
That's also I think a question. My first question for your second question was, what's the one that's we hear a lot? And that's definitely one that we're hearing a lot with Bernie Sanders' popularity. I also think it's funny how they talk about Scandinavia as if it's just one country. It's like 4 different countries.
Oh, Bernie probably thinks it is.
It's like Denmark. I think it's Denmark or Finland. Finland ranks higher than we do on economic freedom. Like, I'll take Finland socialism over American capitalism if that's the difference. Like that's
I wouldn't be surprised if after he loses the Democratic nomination that if he asks Hillary Clinton if she would name him ambassador to Scandinavia.
Yeah, Scandinavia. Just all 4 of them. Go ahead, Jeff.
No, I was just actually going to. I had just a follow-up thought about the. But I actually forgot what I was going to say, so never mind.
That's right.
On the subject of Bernie Sanders, do you think there's any lessons which could be learned from the current economic chaos that is happening in Venezuela? The shortages of everyday products, the hyperinflation, just all of the economic malaise that is currently befalling them. Do you see any sort of major cognitive dissonance between a rising socialist candidate in the United States, while we have a perfect example of a completely failing state happening?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a direct connection. Of course, people like Bernie Sanders, who were all in favor of what Chavez was doing, and even Maduro, his successor, early on. If you press them on this, they'll say, "Oh, well, that's not quite what we had in mind." Or we can do it better if we have maybe smarter people. or it's the collapse in the price of oil. That's why, it's everything but socialism. It's causing Venezuela's problem. This is a problem endemic with socialists. They never learn from the failures of their own handiwork. They're constantly flitting from one scene of disaster to another. For a time they were all hopped up about Yugoslavian worker socialism. I remember that way back when, 30 years ago. Well, then that fell apart. So then they moved on to, fill in the blank. They never learned anything, and Bernie Sanders ought to own up to what's happening in Venezuela. He was one of those who said, "Oh, leave them alone because they've had democratic elections." People like me were saying, well, of course leave them alone, but there wasn't a whole lot democratic about the way those elections were rigged. But nonetheless, we'll give them that. It's, they voted themselves into socialism. I'll give you that. Well, now they have it. Bernie and his friends should own up to the effects. It's been an absolute disaster. Expropriations of businesses. More than 1,000 have been taken over by the state, on top of the already monopoly of the state that they had in things like oil. And they never admit that their own central planning played any role in the disaster. It's like, oh, well, we'll get it right the next time. There are times when I think that progressives are just infantile in their thinking. That things like reason, logic, evidence, experience, history, fact don't seem to count for anything with them. It's just this ideology of, beat up the successful and give things away for free and get elected in the process. I mean, it's no deeper than that.
It makes me laugh, the joke about, what did socialists have before candles, electricity, and I never thought that I would actually see it happen in real life with Venezuela government shutting down power for such long periods of time. I never thought it would happen before my eyes.
Yeah,
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I was just going to compare to that famous picture of North Korea where the only little dot, compared to South Korea, where the only little dot of light is Pyongyang. We're just going to have another similar picture of Venezuela soon.
Absolutely, and that what that little dot of white light was. It's Kim Jong-un and his the one-man internet opportunity there. Who knows what he looked like?
Tablet developed for no market that I read.
Yeah.
I also love. You mentioned the oil prices dropped. Talk about another progressive myth. That's the reason. That's my favorite one because that's the socialist. Blaming oil prices dropping is basically an implicit admission that Venezuela's socialist economy is dependent upon them producing something and then exporting it for free market traded goods. That's what that is.
That's right, and it's also an admission that their wise central planners didn't see that price drop coming.
Yeah.
Central planners are supposed to see the future and plan accordingly.
It's all socialist countries are dependent upon free market. I think one of the high-ranking people in the Soviet Union said they wanted the whole world to be socialist except New Zealand because they needed something to base their prices on. That's what it makes me think of. Exactly. Okay, I have another question that's... Oh, I'm sorry.
Let me just add, if I could, Chris. Socialism, we need to drive this home to people. It has no theory of wealth creation. It is just a fantasy about what to do with it once somebody else creates it. That's all it is. Yeah. And it's utterly impossible unless somebody else in a capitalistic fashion creates wealth in the first place that then the socialists can expropriate and play games with and try to win elections with or please their favorite constituencies.
I think it's a really important thing to point out about it. It's just, what do we do with wealth? I think even in Atlas Shrugged, Ayn Rand talks about one of the villains. He's like, you act like these factories were just natural resources.
Yeah.
Factories, yeah. Okay, I have another question. We're coming to the end of our time, so I'm going to ask my one last progressive myth. Jeff has an unrelated question, then we'll close up. But the one I did want to make sure we get to is one of your myths is about Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. I hear this one all the time among other, history people. So that's proof, Dr. Reed, that's proof that we do need at least some regulations in the economy, right?
Yeah, I hear it all the time too. I just yesterday, I think on my Facebook page, somebody said something to the effect that, well, what about the meat packers and didn't they do terrible things and so forth? So I just sent them the link to the chapter in the book that deals with it. But many people are taught that Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, is some kind of documentary. But it wasn't, and not even he pretended it to be. It was a work of fiction. He hardly spent any time at all in the meatpacking plants of Chicago. Even Teddy Roosevelt accused him of being a notorious, nonstop liar. The fact is, we had government inspection, state and federal at the time. If you go back to the debate in the congressional record, you'll find over the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, which was prompted by Sinclair's book. You find congressmen saying, wait a minute, we've got meat inspectors. What Sinclair wrote is true, that the conditions are so awful. Were they asleep at the switch, or were they bribed, or what? Why is this the case for more regulation? Well, what happened, and of course, you know, there's a place in there in his book where Sinclair talks about men being falling into vats, being ground up into meat. Well, when I started doing research on this, I wanted to find out, what are the names of these guys? Surely there must be a monument to them somewhere. They'd be great progressive icons, you know. Surely somebody said, what happened to Bob today? Or Bill didn't come home from work, you know, where is he?
We're eating Bob.
Yeah, we're going to have him for supper. But there are no names, because it never happened. It just never happened.
Well, let me play devil's advocate, though. I wanna knock this up a notch and challenge you a little more. Upton Sinclair, you're right. The Jungle was fiction, but the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, which is a real-life analogous story, was not fiction. This was a fire in a factory that killed a bunch of women. And I mean, you're talking they built fire escapes that didn't reach the ground, and they would lock these. They would actually put locks on the door and lock their workers in at night so that they couldn't leave. And that's a true story. That really did happen. So without government regulating these greedy capitalists, wouldn't we see more of this?
Well, the problem is, you know, you find one case of abuse and then extrapolate from there to blanket regulations against everybody. What you've got in the case of the Triangle Fire is a case for lawsuits for negligence, lawsuits against the employer for promising one thing, that is escape in the event of emergency, and not following through. You punish the wrongdoer, but you don't suddenly have bureaucrats in distant Washington designing and defining what a proper fire escape looks like. You know, socialists never respond that way to a failure of government. They never say, oh, there's a failure, and I can find them every moment of every day. They never say, now we need blanket regulations on government because of this one failure. They only apply that line of reasoning when they see a perceived problem in the private sector. They're usually perfectly happy with flops in the public sector, and they see that as a reason to throw more money at it.
Yeah, and I think people, even libertarians, forget that tort-based solutions are real solutions to the absence of government. I think the progressives, you're right, they make these arguments that you're dispelling in your book, forgetting that lawsuits can solve these problems, and then they laugh about the McDonald's coffee spill lawsuit. That was never, there's no government regulation mandating what temperature McDonald's has to store their coffee, but they store it at a certain temperature now because of that lawsuit. And so does everybody else, because they don't want those penalties. And people forget that the courts are government run, but that is a private example of dispute adjudication that leads to that.
Yeah, and socialists and progressives are up to their eyeballs in victimology. They tend to be very angry, unhappy people. Everybody's a victim. Everybody's being, wiped out or screwed in some way by somebody. And the answer is always saintly politicians who will come in and do the right thing on our behalf. It really is not a very well thought out way of thinking when it comes to either the role of government or the competitive forces in a free society that tend to nip a lot of this stuff in the bud and make them isolated instances.
Yeah, and I will say, just as one more plug for Fee, and it was, I think my answer to that question also came from John Hasness at your directorship. He was definitely the speaker that planted a lot in my head, and I have Fee to thank for that. Okay,
very welcome.
Jeff Peterson has one last question, and then I have my closing question I ask everybody, and we'll wrap up here. Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll keep my answer short.
Yeah, it's a quick. It's in Salt Lake City. I wasn't surprised, but you mentioned that you weren't quite yet, or you aren't an anarchist yet. And I want to know, what is the biggest factor that you would say that is preventing you from taking that leap? Usually it's police, courts, Navy. I just want to know what it was that was kind of keeping you going past that threshold.
Well, I have a lot of confidence in the marketplace, and I've always said that if we ever get to where we have no more government than I want, I'd be happy to look at what's left, and chances are good I'd probably agree with you. I think for us to go the full measure and put markets in charge of even those traditional functions of small government, that is defense, courts, police, I think that's a leap that I don't know that people are yet ready to make, so I have to confess my concern is more a tactical one than it is a principled one, and that does bother me. But you look at those areas that you cite, and already there's a great deal of private competition, private provision. I mean, I think of all the ways each of us provides his own security. You're not entirely dependent upon police. You probably have a security system at your house, or at least you keep the lights on if you're concerned, or
We actually interviewed
lock on your door. I mean, or you got a gun.
Are you familiar with Del Brown?
No.
We actually interviewed Del Brown one time. He is the founder of a private security firm in Detroit that basically makes the police look good there.
Yeah. I think we should be open to those kinds of competing alternatives, and too many people just have a knee-jerk, those things can never in any way be handled privately, whatever. Well, then you hand the government a complete monopoly, and you do that with anything, and the monopolist is going to be abusive.
Yeah.
I like that. I've heard every single. Being an anarchist myself. I've heard every single. About the roads, about the courts, the military, police. But the tactical one is probably the one that I accept as a legitimate answer the most. So I'm glad that that was your answer.
Yeah, I don't think those who believe in private property and also that no government is needed, I don't regard those folks, I assume you guys are among them. You're not the enemy. The enemy is those who want to impose a lot more legal coercion and legal plunder on society. Those are the folks that we need to work on, because they're the ones causing so much harm in society, not those who have confidence in free people and free markets.
Absolutely. As long as we have massive governments like we have, all camps of libertarians are pretty much on the same. I mean, before I considered myself an anarchist, I made a video saying I'm not an anarchist, but here's why I like these guys, and that's the mindset I think both sides should be on.
We're on the same side.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, my last question. I ask everybody I interview this: if you could recommend people just one book. And we're already recommending to everybody, excuse me, Professor, because it's such a good resource, so you can't give that answer. If you could recommend people one book, what would it be? And I should mention some popular ones that have already been used. We can't count Economics in One Lesson, Man, Economy, and State, For a New Liberty. I think those are my big ones that I would expect you might recommend.
Oh, okay. I was holding my breath that you wouldn't name the one I would, and you didn't.
Good.
I would recommend Frederick Bastiat's classic, The Law. It's a quick read. You can do it in an evening, and it has changed lives all over the world. It's a terrific book, and you can get it from Fee at fee.org for a dirt cheap price, great bulk quantity prices, and one version of it online you can even read for free.
You're making a good recommendation, because Jeff just went and got his copy. I have my copy on my coffee table out there right now, actually, as well. And I think that's the one that I mentioned, Leonard Reed, Fee, brought to English after he started Fee. Yeah.
That's right. And to all those political science majors who may be watching your program, sometimes I like to say if it's politics, it ain't science. But nonetheless, that's another issue. But for all you political science majors out there, you ain't a political scientist until you've read Bastiat's The Law.
I like it. I like it, too, because it also shows, when you look at Bastiat and a couple of the other 19th century French guys, you got Gustave de Molinari, his intellectual heir, also on my coffee table out there. You got, I think, Destutt de Tracy, Thomas Jefferson translated him to English, and you almost never hear about him. You actually had a lot of free market French guys back in these philosophes,
Physiocrats,
yeah. And
Kane Turgot was another.
Turgot, yeah,
Disney, Turgot,
Cantillon. I don't know how to pronounce any of these names, but
Yeah, I've forgotten some of those names. Well, don't forget Auburn Herbert. He's not French. He was British. But
Jeffrey
the
Tucker
original
recommended this
voluntarist.
book. Yeah, Right or
Yeah.
Wrong of Compulsions by the State. That's where I
Yes.
first heard of him, was from Jeff Tucker when we interviewed him,
Yeah.
which is why I asked this question, because that's the first recommendation that I actually went out and bought, since I'd never heard of him. So very good
Yeah.
recommendation. Okay, so that's going to be it for our show. We the Individuals will be back. We don't have a set schedule anymore, so we find guests and then schedule an interview around that. But we were super excited to have Lawrence Reed with us today. If anybody is not familiar with FEE, go to fee.org. Tons of articles. You can pretty much get every article in that book on there for free. So this is their goal is clearly to educate, bring Austrian economics and libertarian ideas to young people. It's a fantastic resource. Dr. Reed, thank you for being on.
My pleasure. Thank you,
Good
guys.
seeing you
And
again.
if you have this online at some point, send me the link and we'll promote it on social media.
We'll send it to you right after we shut down.
Okay.
All right. Have a good
Thank you
night,
much.
everybody.
Goodbye.